Stuart Shanker could not be here, but he's going to make a lasting impression on the think tank. He's the founder and CEO of the Merit Center in Toronto and professor emeritus at York University. The thing I want to emphasize is that we see, in terms of what he's going to be bringing to the think tank, tying together the themes of relationships, self-regulation, and the importance of development, as you've heard, as early as possible. So let's listen to Dr. Shanker.
Hi, everybody. I'm so sorry that I couldn't be with you today. I'm in the unfortunate position where my physician is also a very old friend of mine. And when he forbids me from getting on an airplane, I'm in the unfortunate position where I can't ignore him because he knows where I live. So I'll send you what really is a deep sense of disappointment. And I feel this way for a number of reasons. My challenge for today is to talk to you about what stress is in 60 seconds or less. And the short definition is that our brain has all kinds of what we might call homeostatic systems. These are systems that operate within sort of functional ranges. And if they start to go outside of their range, the brain responds by burning energy to bring us back into that functional range. Well, that's what a stress is. A stress is anything which threatens to disrupt one of these homeostatic systems. It could be something like your body temperature, it could be your emotions, it could be something like trying to figure out patterns or causes and effects. But the short version here is stress is something that requires us to burn energy to remain operating at our functional best.
There was a very interesting study done a few years ago comparing stress levels of children today to stress levels of children at the height of the Great Depression. And it reported that children have up to 5 times as much stress today as they did in 1936. Well, this is counterintuitive. This doesn't make sense to us, right? How can children be under more stress today when really we're in a time of plenty? And the answer to that question really takes us into a much more sophisticated understanding of what stress is. And stress is really anything which the brain registers as a possible threat. So what are these stressors? Well, urbanization, at least modern urbanization, these huge metropolises bring all kinds of stressors that we may not immediately think of as stressors, but for a young child they are. And it might be too much stimulation, too much noise, too many people, too much crowding. We think that children will habituate quite quickly, but in fact, the brain is still having this kind of stress response to things that perhaps we don't notice. And really what we're looking at when we look at stressors today are things that affect the child's 5 senses. And we look at lifestyle. There is growing evidence that our children at all ages, including infants, are sleeping significantly less than as little as a decade ago. There's a very common misperception we find in virtually everyone we work with, a tendency to confuse self-regulation with self-control. Self-control, of course, is about the effort that we want a child to make to control or restrain their impulses. But self-regulation is something very different. Self-regulation is something that we've been studying for about 150 years. Self-regulation, in simplest terms, is about how effectively and efficiently a child deals with a stress and then recovers. And what we've learned, the more we've studied self-regulation, is that a child has 5 primary areas or domains of stress. And the 5 domains are the child's physiology, biology, the child's emotions, what we call cognition, thinking, paying attention, ignoring distractions, social behavior, the stress of playing with other children, being in a social environment like school, And then finally, the stress of empathy, of putting someone else's interests ahead of your own. What makes self-regulation a little bit complicated is that all 5 of these levels influence each other. They all interact. And so what we see, I'll give you a simple example. If a child is having problems at the first level, the biological level, this can have quite a significant impact on the child's ability to deal with, say, his or her strong emotions or to get along with other kids. And that has a kind of rebound effect, a vicious circle, because the harder they find social interaction, the more it arouses their problems, their stress at the physical or the emotional level. So when we work on self-regulation, whether we're parents, educators, or people like me, clinicians, we look at all 5 levels. When we try to explain the fundamental difference between self-regulation and, say, compliance, we use the metaphor of a furnace. With a furnace, let's say you set it at a temperature of 20 degrees. So your furnace goes on at 17 and it'll turn off at 22. That's the perfect model for a self-regulating system. It's called a homeostatic system. Now, the way this mechanism works in humans is a little bit more complicated than a furnace. In fact, we have lots of little furnaces and they all influence each other. But the basic principle is actually quite similar. When a child deals with stress, he has to burn a little bit of his energy. So what the brain does is it will trigger a couple of complicated processes to deal with the stressor. And it will release some adrenaline and get your heart racing, raise your blood pressure, increase the rhythm of your breathing, all of these things so you can deal with the stress. And then we have another system that kicks in. It's a calming system. It's like a brake system. We talk about it as being like a gas pedal and a brake. So what we're doing in a self-regulating system, without our awareness actually, is constantly dealing with stress and then calming down again. Well, this is very different from compliance. Compliance is about a child that we believe has the ability, the capacity to behave in a way that we want and is choosing not to. But that's not what self-regulation is about. What self-regulation is about is how much stress the child is dealing with. And if it is too much stress, what we see is a reduced ability to have that balance reestablished. There are certain signs that we go by. It might be that the child has an awful lot of trouble with his or her emotions, or the child has a lot of trouble paying attention, or the signs might be that the child becomes very impulsive. And what's quite remarkable for us as we studied this in the lab is that when we reduce the child's stressors, these behavioral problems or these mood problems resolve quite quickly on their own. So it was never a case of the child not wanting to make an effort. It was really a case of the child not having enough resources, not having enough fuel left over to pay attention, to inhibit his impulses, because he spent too much dealing with far too much stress in his life. One of the more challenging questions that we have to address is how do we create an environment, especially an environment in an early childhood setting, which will really help children self-regulate. Why is it so challenging? Well, it's challenging because no two children are the same. You might think that the way to do it is to say, go in and create this perfect environment where, I don't know, we paint the walls beige and there's nothing on the walls. But now you have a problem. Children's needs can vary not just from child to child, but the same child may have different needs during the day or from day to day. What we want to do when we create these environments is create choice. You may have one child that needs a lot of visual stimulation in order to be calmly focused and alert. But another child finds too much visual stimulation overloading. So what we want is we want to have, say, one part of our room where there's lots of stuff going on, lots of visual stimulation, and another part where it's visually calm, where it's visually quiet. And when we do this, we see something very interesting, and that's how the children will naturally gravitate day after day to those parts of the room where they are most comfortable. And we want to give the children a say. We want them to become sort of like the architects, the masters of the environment where they're happiest. How would you like this to look? You know, what do you want on the floor, on the walls? And they are remarkably perceptive once we start to explain to them what self-regulation feels like. We also want to provide them, especially in this age group that we're concerned with here, with lots of different kinds of self-regulating materials or almost prosthetics. So what we'd like to do is we'd like to have areas where the children are learning and calming. This is the idea that we want. We want to create these islands in our rooms. Right? So this is how we start to look at our environment. And finally, there's a very interesting aspect of all this, and that's the effect on our own self-regulation. And so what we find is that the teachers' or the educators' stress levels drop quite dramatically just by having a self-regulated classroom. One of the phenomena that I find most interesting today is the speed at which everyone that I'm meeting, parents, teachers, administrators, are aware of the importance of self-regulation, starting to understand what it is, but really quite concerned about what they can do to enhance a child's self-regulation. The easiest way to answer this is to identify the 3 key steps of self-regulation. The first step is identify what the child's stressors are and reduce those stressors. So let's take as a very simple example, if a child's very sensitive to noise, then we'd like to give that child lots and lots of ways of dealing with noisy environments. The second step of self-regulation is absolutely pivotal, and this is the step of self-awareness. A child has to know what it feels like to be calmly focused and alert. We can't begin to work on self-regulation if the child doesn't know when they're agitated, doesn't know when they're calm. One of the things that we've discovered in the work we've done on this is some children get this immediately. Some kids, it takes a long time. And so we have to be very patient. We have to return to it frequently in different settings, trying to help them learn this. Now, the third step of self-regulation is, what do you do when you're agitated? For some children, it might be having an opportunity just to be alone, to calm down on their own in a quiet place. So we go through this process with them, and really what we want the child to learn in this third step are 2 things. And this becomes especially important the older the child becomes. The 2 things are what works for me, but the other thing that is very important is what do I need to avoid? What are those things that I now can identify I'm going to find stressful? Once children have these skills, the one thing we do see is they really do want to stay calm.
Shanker self-reg is a 5-step method for managing stress. The first step is reframing, and what that means is really recognizing the difference between misbehavior and stress behavior. The second step is figuring out what the stresses are that have caused that stress behavior. We have all kinds of techniques for helping you get a broader picture of the stresses that a child's under. The third step is reducing the stress. Again, every child is different, so we have to have what we call custom-tailored strategies rather than off the rack. Then the 4th step is helping the child recognize what it feels like to be calm, what it feels like to be becoming overstressed. This is actually more challenging than you might think. And then the 5th step, figuring out what helps that individual child, what helps you get back to calm, what helps you restore and recover. Of all the lessons that we teach at TMC, for me the most important is that there is no such thing as a bad kid. It's one of those statements that sounds really good in practice, but when you try to apply it, you find yourself thinking, well, this is really more wish fulfillment than reality. But in fact, it's true. There isn't such a thing as a bad kid. These are just kids. And what we have found over and over is that when they display behaviors that we find frustrating, bewildering, that make us even angry, that once we begin the process of reframing, what we find is the child is telling us through their behavior that they're overstressed. So What does it mean to say there's no such thing as a bad kid? It means every child is presenting us with wonderful opportunities to help them on the pathway to robust development. I can think of no more fitting way to celebrate, I think, what's going on today than at the Simsman Institute. This think tank is something special, and please, someone tell me afterwards of all the wonderful things that you guys have talked about. Goodbye, everyone.